Oh, hi. I'm Dave Curran. If you like shooting as much as I do, you know how much factory ammo can cost. That's why I save 50% or more by reloading my own ammo with supplies I can get at my local sporting goods store. In this video, I'm going to show you how to take a case like this 454, how to clean the case, how to remove the primer and resize the case, how to put in a new primer, how to measure out your powder. And when you measure out your powder, you can even download powerful shells like this 454. So you don't get knocked on your keister each time you shoot it. How to put in a new bullet, and how to crimp that bullet if necessary. We're going to do this for a 454, and then we're going to do it for a 300 Weatherby. Now with neck-down rifle cases, there's one less die, and consequently one less step. Now remember, we're dealing with explosives, so safety first. You should be wearing safety glasses or goggles throughout this entire reloading process. By the way, be sure to read all the warnings and the safety notices in your manual. For this video, we'll be using RCBS's Rock Chucker Master Reloading Kit. It was the one at the store when I went to buy one. Most reloading kits are basically the same. The only difference will be if you buy a multitasking reloading kit, where every step can be performed at once. But even then, the basic steps will be the same. This video is meant to help you with the mechanical aspects of reloading. It's not meant to supplant a good reloading manual. You will need a manual to know how much powder to load with what bullets. In some kits, like the Rock Chucker, a manual is included. You can buy new or used manuals covering different bullet manufacturers. Be careful. Loads for one manufacturer's bullet may not be safe for a similar bullet by another manufacturer. Now, let's put that bench together. This bench is made of 1.5 inch thick by 11 inch wide boards. It's built high enough so it will be convenient to sit at, and the wide boards will make it relatively stable. Once you've drilled your holes, you need to attach the press to the table. Use good sturdy bolts with washers. The press cannot be too firmly attached to the bench. Then make sure that you tighten the bolts securely, using washers to keep the bolts from digging into the wood of the bench. For our Rock Chucker, attaching the handle is simply a matter of inserting the handle and tightening the nut. Next, we'll assemble, then attach the primer arm. The most important parts of the primer arm are the spring, the plug, and the sleeve. You choose a sleeve based on the size of the primer you'll be loading. You'll note I painted my spring blaze orange. I switch from 45s to 454s often, so I need to change the plug and sleeve often. I've dropped my spring and had to hunt for it. If you lose your spring, you'll be out of business, so you might want to paint your own. To assemble, simply take the plug, slide it through the sleeve, and then slide it through the spring. This then screws right into the top of your primer arm. To attach the primer arm to the press, all you have to do is put the primer arm in place and push in the pin. Assembling the powder measure is fairly simple. Take the hopper and attach the handle so that the handle is facing the same way as the measuring screw. Then attach the stand plate. This simply screws on. If you want the stand plate to stand higher up, then you'd put this nut on the other side, but otherwise you don't really need it. Then you need to pick out a drop tube. The drop tubes have different size openings. I'm going to use the one with the small opening. The drop tube simply screws in. And your powder measure is set. Now the holes in the stand plate can be used to screw your powder measure to the table. And this large hole without threads allows you to attach the powder measure to the top of the press itself. I prefer to have my powder measure attached to a table, and you need just one screw to keep it there. In our next step, we're going to start reloading that bullet. For each size bullet that you'll be loading, you'll need a different size shell holder. They simply slide into the top of the ram. If you turn your bullet holder sideways, you can slip your cases in and out. These are the dies that come in the set for the 454. The first die we are going to be using is the one with the pin in it. It is used to remove the primer and resize the case. This is a carbide resizing die. The carbide coating allows you to resize your cases without using lubricant. In the instructions that come with your die set, it will tell you how far the pin should extend in your resizing die. If the pin extends too far, you can adjust it with this nut and this screw. To start out with, we'll simply screw in the die. We'll be adjusting it in just a few moments when we actually begin to reload. If your kit comes with one of these plastic primer catchers, you definitely want to attach it before you begin removing primers. The first step in reloading is to examine the bullet case you intend to reload. You do this for each bullet case. Dirt doesn't count, but you do want to look for stresses in the metal. Once you've made sure the case is intact and doesn't have any cracks, then you're ready to reload. If you are going to take up reloading, most people buy a kit as I did. And if you buy a kit, there are two things that might not be in the kit that you might want to have. One is a powder trickler. If you're measuring out powder, this makes it much easier to do. The other is a caliper, which allows you to measure the length of your cases. If you fire enough rounds in a case, especially in a neck-down rifle case, it will extend in length, and your manual will tell you when you need to trim the length down. In this video, I'm using one-shot shells, so they're not going to be too long. The die with the pin in it is called a resizing die because as a bullet is fired, the case expands, and this die resizes the case back into its original shape. Only a little bit of shell lubricant is needed on your lubing pad. A small amount will last quite a while. Take about 5 shells at a time and roll them on the pad until they are completely covered. I like this RCBS Case 2 lube because it's a little tacky, and you can feel it on the case when the case is covered. But any good lube will do, and they even have spray-on lube. Remember, with carbide dies, you don't have to use lubricant, though I like using it anyway, even with carbide dies, as it makes resizing easier. In any case, I wanted to show you how to lube your cases. The first thing we are going to do in our next step is turn the die lock nut up as far as it will go, so it won't be in the way when we screw the carbide die down. Next, raise the ram assembly with the shell holder in place as high as it will go by moving the handle. Then screw down the resizing die as far as it will go. When it stops, then adjust the die lock nut and tighten the lock nut on the carbide die with the appropriate tool. If this were a steel die, we would have lowered the ram, then turned the die a quarter turn further. However, because it's carbide, and carbide is brittle, we don't give it that extra turn, which does add extra pressure. Our next step will depend on how we're going to clean the cases. Here I'm going to wash them, so the next step is to remove the primers. If I was going to use a vibratory cleaner, I would clean them before removing the primers so as to avoid cleaning media getting stuck in the flash hole, which would have to be cleaned out for each case. Since we are washing, we'll be removing the primers and resizing first. Slip a case into the shell holder, making sure the case goes as far into the shell holder as it can. Pull down on the handle. The primer will pop out into the primer catcher tray. After you've resized your case, you may want to check the overall case length. Your cases will need to be relatively the same size for crimping. Now that we have our cases primerless, we're ready to wash them. Now, you can buy an electric cleaner, which is basically a drum you fill with cleaning media, corn cob or walnut shell, that vibrates and rubs the dirt off, or you can use boiling water and soap, which is of course the least expensive. We remove the primers first because if we wash with water, water could get trapped around the primer, which might corrode the case.
Be sure to wear gloves when you pour your bullets in it. I like like to rinse with boiling water to get the soap off. You can dump them out on a paper towel to dry. Sort of like French fries. Although boiling with soap and water does get the powder residue out, it does tend to dull the brass cases. That's why many people use a tumbler instead.
If you do want shiny shells for the shooting range, there are many inexpensive case cleaners on the market. And because it's a simple mechanism, you don't have to spend on a name brand. A little case cleaner, some walnut media, and you're set. Next, we'll be using the expander die. This die has a bulb inside, which expands the lip of the case so a bullet can be inserted. First, we remove the resizing die, leaving the lock in place. Next time, we can just screw this right in without having to adjust it again. Next, we adjust the expander die we're going to put in. Move the lock back as far as it will go. Move the expander back by turning this screw here, pretty much so it will be out of the way. Then, screw it into the press. Lift the ram arm up as high as it will go with the bullet holder in place. Then screw down the die until it touches the top of the bullet holder. Make sure you keep the lock out of the way. Now comes what I consider to be the hardest part of reloading. We have to flare out the opening of the case so a new bullet will fit. Notice the bullet doesn't really fit in a newly resized case. The problem is if we lower the expander too far, it will make the mouth too wide, and then the case won't fit in the gun. Keep a bullet handy so you can check whether the case has been expanded enough. Put the case in the bullet holder and extend the ram as high as it will go. Move the nut out of the way by turning it up. Then screw the plug down as far as it will go. When it stops, lower the ram. Give the plug a quarter turn further. And raise the ram. Then check to see if the bullet fits. If it doesn't fit, lower the plug another quarter turn. Put the shell back in, raise the ram, another quarter turn. And that definitely fits.
The right fit is not an easy fit. It's rather a tight one. It takes a little bit of trial and error. If you do it wrong, if you have it too tight, this will happen.
Once you've found the right position, you want to tighten this nut so that it will stay in position. Then you want to do all the rest of your shells so they're ready to go. If you do make a mistake, that is, if you screwed this screw down too far so that the expander had flared the case so much that it will not fit into your pistol, all you have to do for that particular case is unscrew the expander, put the sizing die back in, and remember, we have it locked in the right position, so we don't have to worry about readjusting it. So all you have to do is resize the case again, and you're all set. Some people like to insert their primers at the same time they expand the cases. This isn't a problem unless you expand the case too much. If you do, you need to remove the pin. Note the depth of the pin. Undo the nut in the back. The screw screws out the front. And then you have a resizer without a pin. Now you have to be sure you put the pin back correctly. Try to get it to the same depth you had it. If the base of the pin comes out too far, the casing will not go far enough into the resizing die, and the cases will be wider at the bottom and not fit all the way into the chamber. So you want to make sure that it's down just enough that the case gets completely resized, but that the pin has room to remove the spent primer. Here we have our expander die back in place. Whenever you change dies, remember, you always want to check the first case or so you process, just in case there has been a change in your settings. For our next step, we're going to take the expander die out. Now it's time to load those primers into our cases. My kit came with an automatic primer feed. It comes with different sized tubes that can be filled with primers. Keep in mind, it is very dangerous to use the wrong size tube. This ingenious little tray with the ridges allows you to put primers on it, and when you tap it, they all turn open side up. Then you can put the cover back on, flip them over, and now they are all in position to be loaded into a tube. Punch them into the tube. You do need the right size tube. Using the wrong size tube could cause an explosion. I don't like tubes for a number of reasons. One of which is if you dropped it, it could go off like a bomb. Another is the last primer in the tube may get stuck. You don't want to stick anything in a live primer. So what I do is use a spent primer I've removed from a fired case. The spent primer can be cleared out with anything you want. Keep in mind, however, you do not want to load a spent primer into a case. If you use spent primers as your last primer, do it consistently and make sure you never load it into a case thinking it's a live primer. I rarely load more than 100 bullets at a time, so I don't feel I need the tube. I'm going to be doing 19 cases today, and since each row has 10, I only need to dump out 2 rows and then put 1 primer back. To reload a primer is simplicity itself. First, make sure you're still wearing your safety glasses. Then, put a primer open side up in the sleeve of the primer arm. Put a bullet case in the bullet holder. Raise the ram, push the primer arm in, then lower the ram to bring the case down on top of the primer. Raise the ram and take the case out and examine the seating. This is a well-seated primer. What you might want to do is put the bullet seater in just loosely. If the bullet seater is in place, if a primer were to explode while you are trying to load it, having a die in place might keep the explosion from going up toward your face. Please note that with a well-seated primer, the primer itself is well below the lip of the case. The bottom of the primer does not extend past the lip of the case, so it can't be hit by just anything and set off accidentally. With a not so well-seated primer, the primer extends above the lip of the case, and this is dangerous. However, if you do have a primer which extends above the lip of the case, all you have to do is put it back in the press. Then, without putting another primer in, push the empty primer arm into position beneath the case. Lower the ram, and the primer arm will force the loose primer into the case. The primer is now below the lip and seated perfectly. Next, we'll measure out our powder. I'll be using Winchester 296 powder to load my 454s. What I'm going to do is take this powder and pour some directly into my powder measure. To adjust your powder measure, first, you loosen the measuring screw lock nut, and then adjust the measuring screw. You'll notice that there are graduations on the screw. On this powder measure, each number represents approximately 10 grains. You can adjust the volume of the powder being measured out by adjusting this screw. Scales are delicate, and you need to assemble them carefully. Keep in mind that you may have to dust your scale in order for it to weigh out powder accurately. When all the weights on your scale are set to 0, with the scoop in place, the arm should point to the 0 line. If it does not, it means that your scale is not level, and you can level it by adjusting the foot. When I fill a powder scoop, I like to press it up against the drop tube. That way, when I lift the powder measurer's arm and drop it, the powder released doesn't spray all over the floor. Adjust your scale to the weight and grains you expect to weigh out. Mine is set to 31.5 grains of 296. Place the scoop on the scale. If the amount of powder you just measured out is not the right weight, you'll need to readjust your measuring screw. In if the weight is too high, and out if the weight is too low. Once you have your powder measure adjusted, turn your cases upside down to make sure they are empty. Put them under the powder measure and load as many cases as you want. However, many people like myself use a powder measure only as a starting point. I use the powder measure to get my powder close, then use a scale for consistently accurate loads. So, for my 31.5 grains of 296, I'll set the powder measure so it weighs out just under that amount. Then I'll use a powder trickler to bring the amount up to the exact weight. For the 260 grain spear bullet that I'm loading, this is a light load. Before you lighten a load, check your manual. I know this one is safe because I've loaded 45s shot from the same pistol with a lot less of 296, so I know the bullet will not get stuck in the barrel. If you use a funnel to put powder into your case, you need to hold the funnel tightly to the case. Note that with this load, the powder actually comes up pretty high. You can see it in the case itself. With some bullet and load combinations, the load will barely show, and you have to watch out for double loading, especially when you're using only the powder measure for filling cases. That's why I like seating a bullet as soon as I put the powder in the case. Double loading is very dangerous, and that's why I recommend you turn your cases upside down before putting powder in. Do it over an appropriate container, of course. My Spear manual recommends filling all the cases, then using a flashlight to examine them to make sure that the loads are the same. Use whatever method you feel will be safer for you. Some sets of dies come with extra cedar dies. This 45 set, for example, comes with one cedar die for round nose bullets and one cedar die for flat nose bullets. If you get extra cedar dies, use the cedar die for the bullet you are loading, especially when loading unjacketed or partially jacketed lead bullets. Now, let's seat that bullet. Lift the ram as high as it will go. Then adjust the die so that it's one full turn away from the bullet holder. You want to leave a wide gap between the bullet holder and the die because the die can crush or distort the bullet case. Tighten the lock nut. Loosen the bullet seater so it's out of the way. Lower the ram. Put your case with the powder in it in the bullet holder. Hold the bullet right over the case, then guide it up into the die as you raise the ram. In many bullets, you'll find a groove called a cantilure. In our case, it's a place where the case can be crimped to the bullet. It will be our target as we begin screwing down the cedar plug. Make sure you check your loading manual to see which cantilure to use if there is more than one cantilure on your bullet. What you need to do is screw the cedar plug down in small incremental steps. each step pushing the bullet a little deeper until you get the right depth in the case. When the cantilever is covered by enough of the case to ensure a proper crimp, the bullet is seated correctly. You can check whether your bullet is seated to the correct depth with your caliper. You can compare the length to that of a factory load, or just make sure that the length does not exceed the maximum overall case length listed in your manual. For bullets with cantilevers, we'd still have to crimp the bullet. But if we had seated a bullet without a cantilever, we'd be done. And you would want to lock the nut on the seater die to keep it in place. Here's how to set up your press to load and crimp a bullet in one step. Once you have your cantilevered bullet seated to the proper depth, you want to raise the seater plug well out of the way. You can even take it out, and then loosen the die itself. Loosen the nut, get that out of the way. Raise the arm with the loaded cartridge in place as far as it will go. Then screw down the die until it stops, which means it's hitting the shell casing. Lower the ram. Give the die 1/2 turn more, then raise the ram, and your bullet is crimped. Put your newly crimped bullet and seater plug back in. Raise the ram, lower the seater plug until it stops, tighten the nut, and you can now load and crimp all your bullets in one step. Now, we've roll crimped a 454 for a revolver. Some loads don't have to be crimped, and there are slight differences for taper crimping automatic loads. Check your manual. What if you make a mistake? There's a wonderful tool called a bullet puller that looks like a hammer. It's got a little holder back here. You loosen the tightener. Take the bullet that you want to unload and put it in the holder and tighten it up. And then, like a hammer, use short, medium blows, and bullet and powder will fall out into the bottom of the bullet puller. You can actually use all of these again. Nothing will be damaged. Primer will still be in the case. If the powder was the right powder, you can reuse it. Otherwise, throw it away. If you've just reloaded a round, you pull back the trigger, and instead of the loud report that you expect, you get this. Do not pull the trigger again. If you can open the cylinder, turn the barrel up, then using a screwdriver or rod long enough to reach the bottom of the barrel, but not so wide as to scrape the rifling, use a mallet to hammer the bullet out. Obviously, the damaged bullet cannot be used again. Now, let's move on to neck-down cases, the kind more commonly used in rifles. As I said before, with neck-down rifle cases, there are only 2 dies, so the cases are simpler to reload. If you're going to be using a case tumbler to clean your neck-down rifle cases, you'll want to do that first. The next step is to lube them. Again, when the casings are lubed correctly, you should be able to feel the lube on the shell casings. You don't want to get the lubricant on the neck. You can put a little lubricant on a brush and use that to lube the inside of the neck. With neck-down rifle cases, the mouth of the case is automatically expanded as the case is removed from the resizing die. A little lube inside the neck can make that easier. The outside of the neck does not have to be lubed. The first die that we are going to use is the one with the pin in it that will extract our primer, resize our case, and expand the case mouth. Our 300 Weatherby dies are steel. With steel dies, we set the die up differently for resizing. First, make sure your dies are indeed steel, as carbide dies are brittle. When you are sure you have steel, raise the ram as high as it will go, then screw down the die until the die hits the bullet holder. Lower the ram, 1/4 turn more, adjust the nut, and then tighten it. So remember, with steel dies, you lower the die a 1/4 turn. With carbide dies, because the carbide is brittle, you avoid pressure from the bullet holder. So with our steel die in place, put a lubed shell casing into the press and raise the ram. and the case is resized. Because the expander is in the die, the mouth of the case is now ready for the bullet. If you're going to use the water cleaning method to clean your neck-down rifle cases, you should do it now. Case length readjustments are much more likely with neck-down rifle cases than with pistol cases. The time to check your cases is right after you've resized them. If the case is too long, the loaded bullet will not fit properly and could cause a dangerous situation. You'll need to trim. You'll find a maximum case length as well as a recommended trim-to length in your manual. My kit came with a trimmer and 4 holders. This one fits my .300 Weatherby. They slip on like this. Now in this case, we'll be using a .30 caliber guiding pilot. The pilot goes right in here. We tighten it so it doesn't fall into the case. The case snaps in. The guiding pilot goes into the case mouth to hold it in place. And we are almost ready to trim. By the handle of the cutter, we have 2 brushings. The larger is the fine brushing, and the smaller is the rough brushing. The larger is on the smaller rough brushing. You separate your brushings by holding the larger and turning the smaller counterclockwise a couple of turns. Push the brushings up to the cutter housing. Lock the rough cutter in place. This fine cutter's adjustment is 1/1000th of an inch for each of these lines, much like the lines on a combination lock. If you know you need to trim the length of your case 21/1000th of an inch, you would turn it so that 21 lines pass by. Then you lock the fine cutter. The gap you've left between the fine cutter and the housing is the same length as you need to trim from your case. When you've trimmed enough to close the gap, you're done. The slivers of brass that come off your casings as you trim them are a lot like broken glass. If you touch them, do not rub your eyes. Trimming brass always leaves burrs on the edge of your case's mouths. You want to use your deburring tool inside and outside. Again, do not touch your eyes with anything that's been associated with slivers of brass. You have to get the burrs off or they will interfere with reloading. Now, let's finish up loading our neck-down rifle case. Because the Weatherby takes a different primer size, the first thing I did was change the primer sleeve. From this point on, seating the primer, filling the case with powder, and seating the bullet is exactly the same for a neck-down rifle case as it is for a pistol case. I will show you a trick, however, that will save you a lot of time in loading bullets that do not have cannelures. On your die, make sure the lock nut is turned up as far as possible. Also turn the bullet seater up to get it well out of the way. Lift the ram as high as it will go. Then screw down the die until it touches and stops. Then screw down the nut, and you can lock it in place. Lower the ram and take the case out. Take a factory-loaded cartridge. Place the cartridge in the bullet holder. Lift the ram all the way. Then very gently screw down the bullet seater until it stops. Take the factory bullet out. Put your casing in. Raise the ram. Put your primer in. You can use a powder measure to measure out your rifle rounds powder just as you do for your pistol ammo. However, I'll be using a scale to measure out 77.0 grains of powder for my Weatherby load. Make sure when you're using your scale, especially with big loads like this, that the weight is centered on the amount you want. In this case, 70 here and 7 over here. I'll use the powder trickler to trickle out my powder. Too much. I'm using IMR 4350, a powder made for rifle loads. There is more than one powder named 4350, but these powders are not the same. H4350 is not the same as IMR 4350, and these powders cannot be used interchangeably. Consult your manual and be certain of the powders you are using. Take your neck down bullet, add your powder. Put your powder-filled case in the press. Get your bullet, guide it in, and your bullet should come out perfect. If we compare the bullet we just loaded to the factory one we used as a model, we'll see they have exactly the same seating. Because ours is a hollow point, the tip doesn't extend as far, but the bullets are seated the same. One more word of warning on what's called hang fire. In addition to the situation where you forgot to put the powder in the case and a bullet gets stuck in your barrel, another dangerous situation exists when you pull the trigger and for a moment nothing happens. Don't pull the trigger again. Keep the gun pointed in a safe direction for at least 15 seconds, if not more. What you could have is a hang fire. This can be caused by a bad primer or wet powder or some other reason. What it is a delay in the rate at which your powder is burning in your cartridge. Until you are sure you don't have a hang fire, keep that gun pointed in a safe direction. Finally, this is one piece of equipment you don't have to have, but it will enhance your enjoyment of reloading. The device is called a chronograph. The prices range from inexpensive to very expensive, the more expensive models containing computers which do all sorts of calculations for you and can even print them out. The chronograph detects shadows passing overhead and thus the speed of your bullet. By comparing the speeds of different cartridges loaded with a powder measure, for example, you can tell how consistent they are in speed, or by using the formula on the screen, how much energy in foot-pounds your load has for hunting. Okay, we're at the end, and I have to tell you, do not exceed the maximum loads listed in your manual. Do you remember the opening of this video? I fired a pistol, and after it went off, my hand went up toward my face. That was because a piece of powder had actually hit me in the face, and it actually drew blood. Two things you really need to remember. Do not exceed the maximum loads. That load wasn't even near the maximum. And two, make sure you're always wearing safety glasses and also ear protection. Now, if I hadn't had safety glasses on and that piece of powder had hit me in the eye, I could have been blinded. So keep that in mind. Finally, let's go over what we talked about and see what you'll need for reloading. First, you'll need the right size bolts with nuts and washers to attach your press to a bench. You'll need screws. You might need them for your powder measure, but you will need them for a trimmer because that has to be secured to the bench. Safety glasses and ear protection. A reloading kit, including a reloading manual, a press, a powder measure, case lube, a case lube pad, and a brush, a priming arm, a primer tray, a scale, and a case trimmer with a deburring tool. Extras if you want them, such as a powder trickler, a caliper, a case tumbler if you want to clean that way with walnut or corncob media, and a polishing agent, or detergent and a pot if you want to use water, a bullet puller, and a chronograph. And that's it. I hope you learned from this video, and I wish you safe and happy reloading.